In this episode, I am joined by Miles Neale and Matthew Freidell to discuss their documentary film, The Missing Piece. The film's description states, Borobudur is a 1250-year-old Buddhist monument located on the island of Java, Indonesia. It was designed as a kind of ancient technology to broadcast the frequency of peace around the world. The only problem is Borobudur is missing its most important piece. Follow along as two masters from two different traditions with a goal of reactivating this powerful relic at a time when the earth needs it most. Miles and Matthew share the remarkable story of the making of the film, including the powerful life lessons both men learned along the way. Miles and Matthew also reflect on the power of pilgrimage, learning to trust intuition in life and the creative process, and the strategies they employed for dealing with local land spirits on location. So without further ado, Miles Neale and Matthew Freidell. Miles Neale and Matthew Freidell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us. I'm wildly excited to talk to you and always enjoy your show and the depth and creativity and all the integrity you bring to it. So thank you so much for having us, Steve.
Thank you. And well, the origin of this episode is quite fun. I was sitting in a cafe in Kathmandu, minding my own business, and then I glanced to my left, and who did I spot out of the corner of my eye? None other than Miles Neale and Matthew Freidell. Of course, Miles, we've had a very interesting episode indeed on this podcast before, and I was so surprised to see you there. And so we hugged and remarked on how strange it was to see each other in Kathmandu. And you informed me of a project that was in the works and is now complete. And that project is The Missing Piece. I've watched now The Missing Piece. It's available on the internet, 8 documentary episodes. And wow, what a beautiful film it is. The style of the film, the way it's shot, is just gorgeous and so evocative. And the premise of the film, the whole setup, what was being recorded, really unique and remarkable setup indeed. And so I won't spoil that by trying to describe it myself. I'll let you do it. But I'd just first of all like to say congratulations to you both on such a wonderful film.
Well, thank you so much. And I mean, Matthew is the filmmaker, so I feel the same way. I mean, I share your awe of his creativity and his a unique style, I would say. There's something very special and unique and very specific about his offering, and the way that it came together is one thing, but the way it was shot and put together is a remarkable, feat. And so, and also I hope we get into it, but Matthew's process to get to this juncture, I think, is also really inspiring and very relatable. So I hope we're able to talk a little bit about how the film came to be, not only what's being shot, but let me also just join you, Steve, and just congratulating Matthew, and what a great offering it is.
Thank you both. It's funny, we ran into you in Kathmandu. I think Miles and I were literally just sitting there talking like, okay, we shot this stuff because we're also up there shooting another film that's going to be released later up in the Sum Valley of Nepal. And we were like, Miles asked me, he's like, so what are you going to do with it? You're just going to put it on YouTube? You're not going to, I'm just like, yeah, I don't know. Someone will find it. And literally at that exact time, we look over and like, oh, hi, Steve. So it's just like these little moments of, synchronicity have followed us to this whole project. So this was just the latest in a string of them.
Yes, I've heard you talk about that there were lots of synchronicities and unlikely successes and close calls and good fortune, etc., that followed this project. I'd be interested if you might say something about that. But first of all, who are you both? How did you meet? And why did you decide to collaborate on this project? And it seems like you're now going to collaborate on future projects also. So how did that begin? How did the two of your stories come together? I know, Miles, for example, that you moved to Bali in from New York. You left your whole network there. You were very established and very involved as a therapist and in other aspects of the community there. And you just upped and left to Bali. the behest of a series of visions, I believe. And Matthew, you also came to Bali in something of a crisis. Your life, you've described, you've said before, was a mess, direct quote. So who are you both, and how is it you met, and how did this collaboration come to be?
Go ahead, Matthew.
Want me to start? My mess. Let me get into my mess. No, my professional background's in documentary film. I spent about 15 years working professionally in documentaries, mostly post-production, some production, and living in Los Angeles. And yeah, I guess over that time, I kind of built what I thought was a, fulfilling life, or it was what I imagined that to be, family, career, home, children. But I think a series of events sort of began to unravel that, as fulfilling lives are wont to do, and yeah, I think everything kind of changed in 2019, and one thing led to another, and I spent a good deal of time in the down in the Amazon, about a month there, um, doing some plant medicine and shamanistic initiations, and I don't know, I think that's a whole nother long story, but that kind of was a sort of, I guess you could say, like an ontological suicide for me. Like, it just totally destroyed who I was before, and the reality that I thought the world was constructed from. And so that kind of left me in this sort of bardo state, of just not knowing what to do. And so I found my way to Bali, weird circumstances, and that was right during the time of the pandemic. And people think of Bali as like this paradise holiday vacation spot, and it's also very intense, especially during a global pandemic. And because I think the word in Bali sort of it denotes an offering in Sanskrit. It's a ritualistic offering, often a blood offering, as is often the case here. There's the tradition here is very embracing both the black and the white, the good and the evil, the dark and the light. So that was something that I was met with initially here, was like, something needs to be offered up of yourself, to stay in this place. A lot of people that stay here for longer than a long holiday describe this of something has to be offered, and it's usually pretty painful. So yeah, I was going through a divorce at the time, and just an unraveling of, like I said, career and who I thought I was and what I wanted to do in my life. So it was a good place to offer things up, and in the middle of that process, a couple of years into it, I think I came across Mr. Miles, who was equally in the mess, as we say. And yeah, we made a short film together about it's kind of exploring some of those themes, and with relation to the Buddhist idea of refuge and death, and some of his personal story around his father's passing. And this experience kind of really woke something up within me. It was it kind of brought me also back to Buddhism, which I had kind of had a lifelong fascination with, but then sort of left to study more of the Shiva non-dual tradition. So it was just a meeting of the minds, I guess you could say, and we hit it off. And he calls me up one day after that, and it's like, I'm doing this thing in Java, and do you want to come along and bring your camera? I don't know what's going to happen. We're bringing together my Tibetan teacher, Geshe Tenzin Zopa, and this local Javanese Shiva master, Mangku Jitho, and we're just going to go to this holy mountain and bring these two guys together. And I don't know what's going to happen, but you want to come check it out? And I'm like, yeah. So I had I'm just bringing my camera. I had no crew, no budget, no idea, really, like, in over my head a bit, but I accept the call, and I just trust that there's going to be something that comes of that, because I know that this whole process that led up to that has sort of given me the ability to trust in it. But yeah, so that's where the story started for me.
What can I say? I mean, the world is a bizarre place. I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone, Steve. I mean, I don't know, since the pandemic, if you've just had the sense that there's much more surreal experience, much more synchronicity, much more. I mean, if you're attuned to it, I just feel like the last few years has opened portals and, you know, dissolved boundaries and thinned veils and created a much more psychic experience. That's, looking back, that's sort of how I see things now, that these what seemed like fortuitous coming togethers are much more, once you scratch the surface, they're much more loaded with meaning and potential. But I mean, if I flash backwards, yes, I mean, around 2019, I also just started having bizarre visions and was just at the outset of conceiving my latest book, Return with the Elixir. And I was in Manhattan, and I was sort of not at the tail end of a long career, and not that thrilled being a therapist in a box, in another box within another box, and within a box that's concrete, but also thinking wise was feeling very limited, and my creativity stagnated. And I think the astrology really helped, because I started reading Maurice Fernandez, who's an eminent astrologer. And he, in 2016, already had a prediction about an astrological alignment event that was going to happen in 2020, in January 12, which is called the Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto conjunction. I mean, they've known about it for a long time, but in 2016, he wrote this article in anticipation of what might happen. And yes, it's slightly vague, but on the other hand, it really shows how the world forever changes, and that structural breakdown begins, and that it's sort of a cataclysm event that also ushers in a series of renewals or rebirths. I mean, first there has to be death, and then there has to be rebirth. So that's happening on a global or cosmic scale. And sure enough, in comes the pandemic, and we go into lockdown, and several years of what I would describe as sort of death, the death archetype. And I don't know if you relate to that, Steve, but certainly, you know, people around me, including Matthew, what that feels like on the personal level is just, you know, suffocation. It feels like not being yourself, feeling dissociated, feeling, you know, lost, feeling confused, actually going through physical death or injury. These sort of breakdown events, if you will, started happening. And then there was a sort of choice point. I think many people listening could relate to this choice point that we had during lockdown, which is either you stay in a stasis and you go absolutely fucking batshit crazy, or you take a punt, as they say in the UK. You take a risk and you go for something. And I remember clearly, I sat there with my wife, and, you know, it was still very much lockdown, and I was like, I'm gonna go to Bali. And she was so supportive, and she had 2 kids in lockdown, and I was going to go for 6 weeks. That's not a short time to leave your spouse with 2 young kids. And I remember I had to go through a long flight with a mask and land in Bali and do quarantine without going out and seeing the sun or taking a breath of fresh air for 7 days. And all of this was because I was trying to reach another side. I was trying to get through, I was trying to break through to another side. I was following something deep within me. And I think this is what the film is about, in a way, too, because Matthew and I lived it, which is responding to something inside of us without clearly knowing rationally what the hell is going on. Like there's a pull or an impetus or something, something mysterious unfolding, and you either listen to it and it takes you into the netherworld, or you shirk it off. And in a way, one way to talk about that is a sort of hyper-rationality versus something intuitive, giving ourselves over to an intuitive process. And so I think one way to talk about just Matthew and I's introduction to each other is that we were both simultaneously from 2 different parts of the world, finding our way to Bali to make sense of an intuitive call amidst the kind of death process. And I get a phone call or a text message, maybe it was, or an email, like Matthew introducing himself, saying he's a filmmaker. I don't know how he came across my work, but he's already done a film a nice film with some great people, and he's like, I want to interview you. So I think for Matthew and I, one thing that happened between the synergy was just we were trying to work out our own lives. I mean, it's such a confusing time. I mean, I remember sitting in a temple with Matthew, and the day passed. We were just talking aloud, trying to figure out, like, how do you follow your intuition? How do you make sense of your life? Things are falling apart. How do you find the courage? How do you find clarity? Like, and this is where he was asking me questions about refuge, and I was asking him questions about, I mean, he's been a teacher for me for sure about how to trust your intuition. Because I look at him and I look at some of the big risks that he's made, and I admire him tremendously for them. And so, I mean, part of what I'm trying to say is, I think as a global community, the last few years have been about letting go and entering into the darkness and entering into the unknown. And in a way, either becoming shriveled like a prune and losing our vitality, or you make a move. You take a risk and you take a jump, or you take a leap. And there, your reason no longer works for you. You know, things don't make up sense. I mean, you can look at it right now in the globe right now, the recent assassination attempt and all the malarkey that is unfolding around it. And it's not clear anymore. The world is not a clear place. Facts don't hold up. You know, there are multiple facts on different levels. And like, if you don't have something else other than just your rational thinking mind, you're kind of screwed. So this is something that we've grown over the last couple of years, Matthew and I, through our dialogue, to just begin to rely on something else inside of us. And of course, just like starting any new routine, even relying on your intuition doesn't hold water right away. You fumble and you stir and you grow sea legs somehow. So and that's a common theme in the movie, and it was born out, I want to say, is just born out of our two knuckleheads trying to navigate a crazy new world.
I'm curious then what some of the waypoints for you both have been in this journey of learning to connect with and trust and navigate by this more intuitive dimension. Has it involved, as it does for some, Miles, you said visions. I'd like to hear about that. Has it involved also contact with guides or deities of various types? Miles, you talk a lot about archetypes. I'm wondering how this has developed for you both, and if there are any interesting waypoints that you've reached along the way.
Well, I can say, because I'm in Ithaca, Greece right now, my family home on the island of Ithaca. Of course, Ithaca known for the as Homer's homeland in the Odyssey for Odysseus. And several years back, I was here. I was just about to launch a program in Buddhist studies, and I was at a ruin site. Actually, it's a multiple layered ruin site in which there's like a sort of Byzantine church set upon an even older a monolithic structure here on this island. And I was recording a video for students of this new Buddhist studies program, and I just had a very deep rush, an intuitive rush to change direction and pivot on a dime and make the program more inclusive of mythology and Jung. And it was like, if I don't include mythology, I will be shortchanging people. Was just the sense. Like, I have to include Joseph Campbell, and I have to include mythology, the mythopoetic lens of life. And of course, I made that choice right there and then at this sacred place, and then I rolled it out, and 25% of my students left the course because they had already paid for this course and were expecting something, and then here I come with some like left field, including mythology into the course, and including a bunch of other things like trauma-informed Dharma and other kinds of content. But it was what I'm trying to say is there's something. When I say visions, I'm talking about some strong sense inside of me, and it may or may not include actual visual content. In other aspects, visual content did actually come. I started seeing mandalas. I started seeing Asclepius. Asclepius is a Greek god of healing. He holds a staff with a intertwined serpent rising up above it. I'm not all that familiar with Greek gods. I'm more of a Tibetan kind of deity guy, but I didn't know why they were coming. But I just started getting interested in, and those visions of Asclepius. They led me to the Asclepion, which were the healing sanctuaries of ancient Greece, where they used to have incubation sessions. And of course, incubation sessions where people came for healing, they would have dreams, very deep, probably dreams initiated by some sort of psychotropic substance. And they would go into sort of ecstatic states, or they would go into hypnotic states, or they would go into deep, deep, deep dream states. And then when they would either have an experience of direct healing with Asclepius in their dreams, or they would get some kind of cryptic message. And when they awoke, there would be temple priests there who would interpret the dreams. And so these became the precursor of what Jung and Freud were talking about through dream analysis. And why is all that important? Well, it's important for a number of different reasons. One is that it was in my own personal life, it was expanding the parameters of my being a therapist. I was feeling boxed in, and all of a sudden I was having visions of like what a healing temple used to look like back in history. And there were amazing things at these temples. There was hot and cold spa baths, there was sound healing, there was psychotropic medicines, there was rituals, there was gymnasium, there was theater for catharsis, there was sleep and dream analysis. I mean, crazy holistic before holistic kinds of things. And it was speaking to my soul, because my soul in New York City had just become too confined. And so by following those dreams, I was following a path of expansion, which is, what the celestial cosmic conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter was asking. It was like something, the old institution that holds things together, Saturn, was dissolving, and Jupiter was inviting in an expansion. And so that was happening to me personally. And meanwhile, that was also happening archetypally to our societies. And so, yes, I mean, I was having very strong intuitions. Sometimes there were dreams. Sometimes there were synchronicities, weird coincidences that normally we just dismiss. Like a meeting of two people, random people, we usually just, we flick them away like flies. But if you're open, and this is what I was trying to do by inviting people to consider mythology, is that it switches the lens from hyper-rationality to mythopoetic, to creative. You start to see patterns. You start to see images. Images, of course, are encoded with meanings. And so you open up a bandwidth of reality, just like in the bandwidth of a light spectrum. You open yourself up. And this is not to dismiss literal rational thinking at all, but it's to conjoin literal rational thinking with intuition, suspicion, discernment, creativity, a new language, symbolism. That's the power of myth. It gives us a new way to construct a story, a new way to rewrite a story. And that's exactly what Matthew and I were trying to do as individuals. But I think that's also the critical point that we find ourselves right now, is we're in need of rewriting a new story. And so I don't know, Matthew, if you want to jump in on any of that. I know you mentioned your own ayahuasca. I'm sure the plant medicines helped you find your way out of the rational and into the symbolic. Maybe there are other waypoints for you, Matthew.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's, I mean, that's a big part of it. I would say that it's more of a lifelong relationship, and you actually started as a very unpleasant relationship with, I would say, discarnate entities, I guess is the best way to describe them. But when I was a child, I was constantly haunted in my evenings in the place between sleep and wakefulness, usually hypnagogic states between various beings, shadow, usually sort of these shadow beings, or we guess call them ghosts, or even what most people kind of see now as more of like an extraterrestrial gray alien type entities. So that started off early for me. So I kind of scared the shit out of me as it does. And so I kind of for a long time shut it off and just said, nope, I want no part of this. Go away. And I found that I could block those connections by just forcing switch it off. And so I did that for a long time. And with that switching it off came a worldview shift too, that if I shifted my worldview where those things weren't possible, then they weren't possible, and they didn't come and bother me anymore. And so yeah, but then that all shifted, as we say, it kind of came back. And the experience in the Amazon was interesting for a few reasons, namely the sort of synchronicities that led to what I now kind of see as this relationship with Chenrezig of Avalokiteshvara in the Buddhist tradition. So that deep in that experience, and that I can't really recall it because it was so disorienting, and really a death experience and a bardo experience, and time was very strange and felt like lifetimes really. And so I can't recall exactly when this being came to me, but it was at some point there, and it was a sort of glowing light and a spiraling, the what I now recognize as this sort of, this spiral symbolism. And out of that came this energy, and it wasn't in a, in a shape or a form, but it was this knowing and this deep, compassionate embrace. And that's the thing that stuck with me the most. And then after that period, as I was integrating it, it was like one thing after the other, and it was just little breadcrumbs. Like I remember after one of the experiences down there, I just had this instant, like I need to go back and reread the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so, what do they have right there on the shelf next to where I'm sitting? It's literally right next to me on the bookshelf of this retreat center. And I pull it off, and I just open, I sometimes like to just open books up and see what, where my eye is drawn. And it's the part of the part of where they're talking about, the different, if you're sitting for your teacher and you're helping him do this, you don't have to do anything. Don't worry, he's got this. And then it goes all the way down in the hierarchies till it gets to the bottom, where, if you're sitting and helping someone who has no exposure or connection to the Dharma and is completely ignorant to that, what are you supposed to do? What is the direction? And it's basically more or less just tell them to meditate on the great Lord of compassion. And that's it. And so I read that moment in that book. I said, okay, there's something. So it was like these little pieces, and then of course that led to, there's the healing process from that dissolution was often just listening to mantra, and I just start crying, just like bawling. And but it was so healing. It just felt like so supportive in a way that I hadn't felt in any practice before, certainly with Buddhist practice before, which was more mind and conceptual or just meditation technique oriented. It wasn't the sort of devotional element. And that really came through as a result of that experience. And it just deepened and deepened and deepened to the point where, just this last April when we went to Sum, and I walk in the monastery, and what's there but this glowing 1,000-armed Chenrezig, and I'm just like, oh, I've seen this before. And it was just these moments of remembering, like, oh, okay, the time, to put this stuff into words is very hard to explain, but time just sort of loses its meaning at some points, and things that happened in these altered states can actually connect to future, can connect to past, and it's all very, very fluid. So that was the real takeaway for me there. But also then integrating that into Bali, which is, primarily a Hindu tradition here. But in terms of the entities is very alive, especially, I could share a story just from last weekend. We were up, Miles will get a kick out of this. Akiko, my partner, is doing she organized a course, brought in a Japanese land regeneration specialist for trying to bring some of these land regeneration techniques to Bali that were sort of ancestral Japanese knowledge. And so he's there teaching, and we're doing a little workshop, and we go down to he's showing us how to kind of clear land, and it helps the water cycle to regenerate. If the air is moving, the water is moving. So we're trying to go down and clear this stagnant place where there's all this down bamboo. And I see him, he's like ready to go, and he's like got his machete, and he just starts kind of hacking through all this bamboo that's in the way. And I see it, like, and this guy's very graceful. Like, he had just done something where he can like prune plants like in the bonsai way. But all of a sudden I felt this like intense energy of like, I'm just gonna like whack through this stuff. And then what happens is his machete goes into his hand, and it's instant. And thankfully we had, he didn't injure himself too badly, but we had Chokade that was there. Chokade Kirtiasa, who's the prince of Ubud, was part of the Balinese royal family. And he's also just an incredible teacher and alchemist. And he was like, yeah, we probably should have done an offering here in this space, because this is classic elemental. So thankfully we had the landowner came, did an offering, and it was just, that's how it works here. It's instant recognition. If you're messing with something, or you go into an ecology, you know about it right away, where it's just not the same in the West, or places where these elementals and other beings have been sort of pushed to the fringes. It's not that they're not there. I still believe they're clearly there, but here, at least, I've found, and especially in some of the more wild places or holy places, it's very much alive. So just being in these places can make a huge difference, and that was my experience.
Maybe that's part of our attraction to Bali. I have this quote in Return with the Elixir, which I also start my own podcast with, which is, in order to go forward, sometimes we have to go back. I really like it, because it says so much. And I start my podcast with that because I think you could take it in so many different directions. But one of the reasons that maybe we're attracted to Bali, or why we were following the breadcrumb trail that led us to Bali, is that there's something in us that's responding to going back into time where these wisdom cultures understand, they have a kind of holistic perspective. It's not that the Balinese don't have a rational part of their mind, but they definitely have that very much intact, a deity, spirit. It's called Trihita Karana. It's this philosophy that understands, if you're going to be part of a milieu or context, you better keep your relations good. And your relations are not just lateral with other human beings, but they're also with the nature and the nature spirits, the unseen world, as well as divinity. And so, part of the endeavor of the Balinese, with all of their rituals and their ceremonies, is to have a kind of respect that creates or fosters harmony with their context. And that kind of perspective, I think our Western industrialized cultures have lost. And so we are the recipients of a lost kind of, Graham Hancock calls it a culture of amnesia. Rick Tarnas calls it a society or a culture that has become disenchanted. Others from the trauma world think that we're disembodied. You write down the line, Western societies, industrial societies, more probably better way to describe it, have sort of lost something. What's that something? And what's the result of losing it? We're kind of sick. We're floating. We're disembodied. We're disconnected. We're disenfranchised. We're shrinking. We're shriveling. Our societies are doing the same. Part of the attraction of the journey to Bali, and of course the journey to the Borobudur, which we'll eventually get into, is that the intuition is responding to something ancient, because there's wisdom there. There are traditions and cultures that understood that the way that we relate to the environment, even though you may not see the deities there. This story that Matthew's raising with this guy hacking through And Chokade just sort of, I can kind of see my buddy there, Chokade, smiling and knowing instantly what the hell's going. Like you have to be able to read it. You know, if you just have a biologist there, they're not going to understand. But Chokade sees that incident. He reads it within a context. He sees that that moment of someone who's probably very deft with and skilled with a knife or a machete. It's not an anomaly. It's a sign. And what is it a sign of? It's a symptom of not being connected to an unseen world. And if you want to build a structure there, you better recognize someone or something lives there already.
Yeah.
And it's your responsibility to live in harmony with it. And so, yeah, Chokade probably does a ritual, and then everybody gets on with it because there's a kind of a gesture made, a gesture of acknowledgement, and a sense of communion. Like I have to live with you. And maybe Matthew, your story just prompted me to think about this connection. But when you described having access as a younger person to the netherworld, and it scared you, it probably scared you because our own culture doesn't recognize. What we don't understand scares us, in other words. And so what did you do? You did the best thing that you could do, which is turn it off. And that is, I'm reading that right now as we have turned things off. We have turned these connections off because we don't understand them anymore. And it's not like you turn off the car key or you turn out the lights. There's actually a consequence to turning them off. Maybe you didn't get scared, but maybe that turning off also meant something else inside of you got turned off. Some other, this is also very common in trauma work. If you don't have support during trauma and the feelings overwhelm you, you turn them off, you dissociate. Well, yes, that's helpful in the short term, but what does it mean in the long term when you dissociate? You dissociate from your creativity. You dissociate from your relations. You dissociate from your vitality. So that's why life becomes bleak, meaningless, apathetic, and eventually becomes inert, depressed. So you gain the short-term benefit of not being assailed by the unknown, but you basically wither and die. So you turned it back on, and with it, maybe there's a flood of. You have to kind of navigate the swirl and the tsunami of the flood of the new. But on the other hand, Matthew and I, we probably share this ongoing conversation in Bali of like, it's really challenging, but it's also vitalizing. There's so many unknowns, but there's something being activated at the same time. Something is coming to life. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we will get to it, but I just want to put a pin in this theme because the Borobudur monument has also been turned off. It used to be alive and it used to be active. And many of the sites, the megalithic sites all over the planet, used to be alive and active in a way because of industrialization and our shrinking of our imagination and our disembodiment and our disenchantment and our hyper-rationality. We switched them off. And maybe the archetype of the day, of the time, is reactivating, reanimating, revitalizing, and reviving. Any thoughts?
Yeah, real quick. Because it reminded me, my sister. I talked to my sister a few weeks ago, and she has a similar experience with her son now, who's maybe 6, 7. Is he started to have similar experiences where he's like, oh, there's this being that comes out and talks to me from my closet sometimes, and I've had experiences with my own son having those things, and she's like, what am I supposed to do? I don't just tell him to make it go away. And I guess the thing that I've learned from really this whole last phase and chapter of my life, but really more from Buddhism is no, the best thing you can do is to just offer love and compassion. And it works. I mean, you hear any tradition, there's traditions that have spiritual warfare. There's traditions that can banish and do this sort of warlike thinking. But actually, you talk to people that are experienced across traditions. It's love and compassion. That's it. Offer love and compassion. Recognize them as lost beings that are no different from you and actually are part of you, and offer that to them. And 100% of the time, that's enough to make those experiences, if not stop, more less frightening. So to me, that's kind of the evolution that I've encountered. And now whenever I'm in a place where, I mean, there's very often I'll encounter energies here where I'm feeling like there's very uncomfortable. Just suddenly I get really like a chill or a very the feeling that just something's not right, or I'll get just very angry all of a sudden, like just raged over something stupid, and I'm like, what's going on? And I realize, okay, this is just, here in Bali, the main practice often in the temples is women will put themselves into trance to become possessed. So the entities here are very used to just possessing people, and it's done ritualistically in a container. So you have to realize that what that looks like isn't like a movie. It's often just big emotions that come out of nowhere, or feelings of intense depression, or just my life is awful, it's ruined. And obviously on this island there's techniques for working with that, but to me the easiest and most transformative technique has been just offering myself compassion and love. And that's it. It's simple.
Well, thank you both. So fascinating. And I think you're right, Miles, that this links very well indeed to the specifics of your project, the film, The Missing Piece. I'll read your little blurb that accompanies each of the episodes on YouTube. Borobudur is a 1250-year-old Buddhist monument located on the island of Java, Indonesia. It was designed as a kind of ancient technology to broadcast the frequency of peace across the world. The only problem is, Borobudur is missing its most important piece. Follow along as two masters from two different traditions come together with the goal of reactivating this powerful relic at a time when the earth needs it most. So I wonder if you might say something about the film and the premise of this. Who are these two masters, and what's this missing piece? And how did you find out about this monument in the first place?
Wow, so Matthew, because it predated my involvement. Although I will just say before you start that story, the idea of this being a technology is something that I really have been thinking a lot, because if we think of the stupa or a mandala, it is a sort of ancient technology, and it's more than just a temple, or even Borobudur is more than just a stupa. It's as one of the managers told us in an interview, he said Borobudur is a film. It's a story. But instead of a film, we're used to images moving past us where we sit still in a theater. Here, you are the one that moves around 12,000 or 1,200 different reliefs, carvings into the rock. And as you walk and circumambulate the structure and go up a level, you're told the story. And so it's designed as a technology to take someone who's from any background, any education, any literacy. They can start at the base, and they can be presented with the teachings, from the Kathmandu, which is all about the worldly concerns and the desires and aversions and ignorance that's going to keep you trapped here. And then you ascend and you're introduced to the teaching, which is the teachings of the Buddha, and how to liberate oneself from samsara. So by the time you reach the stupa at the top, you have been imbued with the knowledge in order to actually connect to the energy, which is what that final level represents. So it is a sort of technology in my view, and it's not just a temple or a holy place, or that it's very functional, it's very practical. And so yeah, that's just a little backstory there, but I'll let Miles go into kind of how this all came together.
I mean, I've already mentioned how pre coming to Bali, I was following signs and following visions and responding to things that seemed like an anomaly. Finally, when I made it to Bali, I mean, I've known about the Borobudur for a long time. My teachers have gone there on pilgrimage. It is quite a remote spot, especially if you're coming from the United States or Europe. It's not that easy to get to, but it is the largest physical mandala on the planet and second largest Buddhist monument behind the Angkor Wat. It's significant. And I knew I wanted to go there when I moved my family to Bali. I knew Borobudur would become a destination, and as I have made my way out, like migrated out of my office as a therapist that's just doing neck up kind of talk therapy in a concrete box, part of my own evolution has been to find new venues and new vehicles for therapy. And I've written extensively on how I find pilgrimage to be therapeutic. And as I migrate out of the office space, I've started curating more pilgrimages to lead people not just on a kind of sacred journey, but an inner journey of recovery or healing or renewal, to find something that has been lost, to find or unify fragments within them, to get them back on the ground and with other people, and to head towards a destination in which they're processing along the way. I love the idea or the archetype of pilgrimage. And so when I finally made it to Bali, and I was talking with Chokade, because I met Chokade, the Prince of Ubud, an alchemist, and I instantly hit it off with him. He's one of the main characters in my new book, Return with the Elixir. And I was plotting my next pilgrimage, and it was through my dialogue with Chokade over a year that I was developing this next pilgrimage. The year prior, I had gone from where Steve and I met the other day with all of us up in Kathmandu, all the way to the Vajrasana, the diamond throne underneath the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. And the following year, I was going to bring people to Indonesia, and we were going to do a joint Borobudur Java island hop to Bali for a healing pilgrimage. And I spent some time with Chokade plotting that and assembling a team of wisdom keepers and local talent. And while that was happening, I started having visions. And one of the visions that I had was, of course, I usually do these pilgrimages with a master. I usually do them with Geshe Tenzin Zopa, who does the teachings and does the rituals and the ceremonies in context. So if we're in Bodh Gaya, he may offer the bodhisattva vows and the refuge vows under the Bodhi tree. I started having visions of him up at the top of the Borobudur, which is a symbol of unity. It's a mandala. It's a place of coming together of various elements. And at its pinnacle, I was seeing Geshe Tenzin Zopa confer the bodhisattva vows, but he wasn't alone. He was actually there in my vision with another master, and that master wasn't even of the Buddhist tradition. It was a local wisdom keeper. So the story is an unbelievable story. We won't have time to go through it all right now, but like we've been saying, there are these breadcrumb trails or these nuggets or beads in a rosary. I didn't just dismiss this vision. I went spelunking on the internet to try to make sense of it, and I found this anthropologist named Patrick Vanabroek, who's based in Java. And I started having a conversation. I invited him on to my podcast to have a conversation about Borobudur, and in that conversation, I told him about the vision. I told him I had this vision of two masters, and I wanted to bring my master, but I didn't know who the other person was. And damn it, this guy says, I've had the same vision. Patrick Vanabroek, who is a random fellow to me, ends up not being so random. 10 years earlier, at the very same time, we were both at Kopan Monastery in Kathmandu doing the Lam Rim course at Kopan. And though there were 250 people there that month, Patrick was one of them, and I never met him. But he was deeply, deeply impressed by the Tibetan Tantric tradition. And he had asked the abbot, what should I do with my life at the end of that long month, of course. And the abbot had sent him to Indonesia. And while he was in flash forward 10 years later in Indonesia, he had sort of broken away from the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition to study with these local Shiva masters in Indonesia, specifically in Java, and become a great scholar of Javanese Tantrism. And when I told him what my vision is, he said, I always wanted to do the very same thing. I said, I never had access to a Tibetan Lama, but I have access to the Shiva Tantra master, and I can introduce him to you. I'm like going, what are you talking about? So this is it. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. You have these that is a classic synchronicity, two random people with each with the one side of the coin that the other is missing. And so what happens is we give ourselves over to it. And Matthew gets caught up in that too, because once we had hatched that, Patrick said, why don't you come before you bring your group here, we should probably introduce the two masters. If what you want to do is create a ceremony on top of the Borobudur, and you don't know what that ceremony is, we should probably bring the two masters in conversation. So he said, why don't you come to Mount Lau, a sacred mountain in Java, to meet my master, Mangku Jitho, and we'll put them two together. And that's when I invited Matthew. I said, listen, I don't know where this is going, but I know it's going to be big because it's just uncanny already. At that juncture, it was already uncanny. I said, grab your camera, come on a flight with us. We're going to the sacred mountain, Mount Lau, to put these two masters together. It's ridiculous because it's also, I mean, there's so many threads here. So if someone's listening and they're a bit confused, well, here, welcome to the world. Okay, we are swimming in tentacles and threads, and it's hard to put them all on a loom and hard to create a tapestry. But I think Matthew does a great job following all the threads, and eventually you get to the main, knockout punch. But one of these other threads is this mythology of the Shiva Buddha, Saptapalan prophecy. And I don't want to get too into it because it's a controversial prophecy, but Steve's well familiar with the Kala Chakra Shambhala prophecy. And as I write in my book, there's some very common themes with the Saptapalan Javanese prophecy and the Shambhala prophecy that's found both in the Hindu and in the Buddhist Tantra tradition. But nevertheless, there is this archetype that there once was a syncretic religion called Shiva Buddha. And about 600 years ago or 700 years ago, something like that, these two traditions were not discrete. They were practiced simultaneously. In other words, Shiva and Buddha were considered one essence in two forms, and they were revered, possibly revered and practiced and devotional practices towards them at the Borobudur. And then because of time, space, history, conflict, the bearers of that syncretic religion moved to Bali. And in the space of centuries, the two religions fall apart. But there is a prophecy that there would come a time 500, 600 years later where they would be reunited at a time of great darkness, something like that. Of course, I don't view any of these prophecies literally. I view them as archetypes. They are dualities coming together. There's several stories that I write about in the book that other people have accounts of these two archetypes, whether you call them masculine or feminine, whether you call them reason and intuition, whatever way you want to. Someone told me that the Shiva Buddha represents love and liberation, this idea of transcendence and this idea of embodiment and love, compassion in the world. They are slowly coming together. And Mangku Jitho and Geshe Tenzin Zopa also represent these two kinds of different energies. They one very, very masculine, one very feminine. Of course, both integrated. They're both integrated in their own ways, but they as archetypes, they were coming together to bring and merge their vibration and their energy and their dispositions. So this is another fascinating thread that runs through the movie, and I think is also just out there in the world. It's like, how do you build bridges? How do you combine? How do you bring what's offline back online into the fold, where we are at a critical point where we feel fragmented? And this ceremony happens just at a time where that fragmentation is like at its pinnacle. And so I want to invite Matthew, and if there's any, or Steve, if there's anything right there in this swimming in this ocean right now, the Shiva Buddha, the two masters, we're heading up towards the pinnacle of the Borobudur. The Borobudur is a symbol of unity, and then we have the chatra. Okay, Matthew, why don't you take it over? Like we have the players here.
I mean, first let me set the stage of who these two people are, because maybe viewers can help to imagine the story. Like Geshe Tenzin Zopa is this bubbly, funny, joyous, just childlike energy and enthusiasm coming out of this man. I mean, you can't be around him and not just be smiling. And it's so gentle, so compassionate, so just ready to meet whatever goes wrong. We see him on pilgrimage, and it's just he's meeting it with joy and compassion. And then you have, on the other hand, Mangku Jitho, who is also a very compassionate, loving person, you could see, but he's the type of guy who, okay, so he took me into his he's seen as he was sort of led into the forest at one point to meet the entities, and he was taken away, basically kidnapped. It kind of sounds like what we would call like an alien abduction experience now in the sci-fi sort of context of the West. But he was basically taken in by the entities and given the knowledge, and then said, okay, you need to go take care of this community. So he's very powerful, but he doesn't leave his village. He's just, these are my people on this mountain. This is my community. I'm just here, a humble priest here to take care of them. But he's also, you go into off his kitchen, he has this room where he keeps all his kris knives, not just his. And the kris knife in Indonesia is a very powerful magical instrument. They're revered, and often they're cursed, meaning they hold power of they make you ill. They're very feared often here, and sometimes people come into possession of them, by a dying relative, or they find them or something, and suddenly everything in their life starts breaking, and they're like, I got to get rid of this thing, but they can't just throw it because it keeps coming back to them somehow. So he's sort of got this like adoption agency going, where he just takes in these kris knives. So he takes me into this room of a closet surrounded by all these knives, and it's like a little like tiny closet, and so he's this big imposing figure because he can hold this energy. He has the confidence. So these are the two archetypes that Miles kind of talking about. It helps to kind of visualize who the people are. But and then the Shiva Buddha is more of, I mean, that's sort of like, even the Indonesian motto, when Indonesia was formed out of various islands after the Dutch rule ended, and after World War II, the motto came from an old Javanese poem, and it's Pinaka Tunggal Ika, which translates to unity and diversity, or I actually prefer different but one. Those are two ways of translating it. So it's sort of like baked into the culture here, even though there's a diversity of religious practices. It's a Muslim majority country. There is still this heart, is this different but one. And so that was sort of like, there was this question that was sort of hanging out there. And as as Americans, it reminded me of this, our motto being e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And there's a difference between those two if you really think about them. And I'll leave that for people to kind of draw their own ideas around how these are different. But that's kind of, understanding that is really to understand what this place is about and what this tradition is sort of in its bones. And so that kind of sets up maybe where we can go next.
Yeah, I mean, we were in that temple, and all I was aware of up until this point in the story is that the two are going to perform a ceremony. We don't know why or what or how. And then in that dark room, as it's depicted, and I don't want to give away too much because it's so well done, Matthew, at your movie, but they both I mean, the same way that Vanabrook and I and Matthew and I from two different corners come together. I mean, that's the power. It's the motif that's repeating itself. Vanabrook on the other side of the world and me bringing these two teachers together. Matthew and me meeting in Bali from two different areas, coming together to process our death instinct. These two masters also recognize prior to their coming together that the chatra, which is the sort of spire or crown, is missing. Hence Matthew's title for the documentary is The Missing Piece. And what they want to do with their ceremony, this becomes a stage for a ceremony to do what? They want to revive the missing piece. They want to fill or complete the chatra. And I think we can just pause here because I like to wear the mythopoetic lens and look at it as an archetype. And then there's, a Buddhist lens, and then there's like a therapy lens, and there's a historic or archaeological lens. There's so many ways to dice this one and talk about it. But just as an archetype, you have the biggest mandala on the planet. It's inert. It's rendered inert. It's turned off. It used to be probably the biggest, most active, most potent symbol in the world, and it's missing this piece. And so even though a mandala is a place of union for discrete sides, energies, aspects of the psyche, of the cosmos, this one little piece is missing. And as Vanabrook mentions in the movie, it's like, if you're just missing that one piece, it's like, even though it represents just a small part of it, it's the quintessential piece. It's the capstone. And so the entire thing is sort of potentless. It loses its potency. Well, these two guys both knew that, and they both came together, and they, by the way, they don't speak a common language. They don't speak a common language, but through their energy and through their intuitions, they are jiving and gelling like jazz players. And they both want to create a ceremony to reactivate and complete the mandala. And of course, in my thinking, and I'm thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, they're going to build one? Are they going to go dig up one? They're going to go to the museum and find one? And they knew before they even uttered it that the way to revive the mandala was to do it energetically. In other words, to do it vibrationally, or to do it with their vision. And this, I think, is an incredible. I mean, and there's so many ways that I can talk about it. I do talk about it in the book, but I think wherever there is something broken, wherever there is disharmony, wherever there is fracture, wherever there is disequilibrium in yourself, as well as out there in the world, the first thing that we have to do is go very deep within and find the place within us that feels intrinsically or innately that actually nothing is broken. And that's what I learned, and that's what I came away with. Not to rush too far to the end in a dramatic fashion, but there's something very, very profound about what those two guys knew instantly about this reactivation process. It has to come from a place of vision and vibration deep within us. And I think that's what we've lost in our industrial age. It's like we will start out there with a business plan of reconstructing things with brick and mortar. No, the reason that things are broken is because of something deep within us. That's how they get broken, or that's how they feel broken. And so it's an inside out job. And I think, Steve, I mean, I'm sure with all your tantric background, I mean, this is how the tantras work: inside out, upside down. They just completely throw you for a tailspin and make you stand on your head to figure it out. Matthew,
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe we should just say, just to kind of, so if people aren't familiar, the chatra is actually, it's a parasol shaped, usually made of gold, that's atop the stupa. So typically the stupas will have different shapes. Sometimes they have multiple parasols. Sometimes they have one large one. There's different shapes. And it's seen as sort of a protection. But also one thing that I like to think of is it's a way of, if you were to kind of pivot your perspective up above and look down on the mandala, it's at the center. And I think one of the most important questions, I try to ask myself often is like, what's at the center of my mandala? Like, which is another way of saying, what do I worship? And like, it brings me back to one of the earliest short films I made, which was about 10 years ago. I made this film called This Is Water, which was based off this commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace. And, he talks about this and he says, whatever we put in that center, whatever we worship, if you put any worldly thing there, it's gonna eat you alive, right? You put money there, you put status there, you'll never have enough. Intelligence, inquiry, being right, whatever it is, even like spiritual transcendence, if you grasping for that, if you put that there, you're never going to find it. And so that's something I'm always like thinking of, like in this moment or in my life or in this stage in chapter, what's at the center of my mandala. So for this story, it's like, it's really important to see that as that kind of symbol, and something is missing and something is broken. And I think we can all sort of feel that right now. And certainly I can relate to that. Back when I was in my mess in my life, it felt like something was really broken and I couldn't figure out what was at the center. The center was not holding and had fallen through, and there was this void there. And so it became this sort of this archetype and this symbol that I think Miles and I could both latch on to very without, conceptually, we felt it. Yeah, so just want to add that.
Yeah, well, after this, I think I might go and watch all 8 episodes again. I've seen it, and I'm excited about it. Thank you both for presenting this so well. Of course, I'll link to all this, the missing piece, in the show notes, and it's available to watch now, along with various other supplementary videos, including a dialogue between the two of you, going into all sorts of behind the scenes and deeper layers of themes and reflections from the both of you, which we haven't discussed here, in fact. So that's also fresh. It's a 45-minute conversation there, kind of behind the scenes. One last question. Matthew, I wonder, I remarked earlier on the style and how beautifully put together the film is, visually and in terms of its structure and so on. And I wonder if you might say something about that from your point of view. I imagine you faced, perhaps not, but I imagine you faced certain technical challenges out there in a remote place, filming and so on, with no crew, by yourself, and holding all the aspects. I wonder if you might say something about that, and also how you conceived of the overall style and direction of the film, which has turned out so beautifully.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's challenging enough, just the logistics of trying to do this all myself and capture what's, if you've ever been on a pilgrimage, things are just happening. A lot of it's internal, a lot of it's hard to express because it's all happening at this subtle level. And now also there are protective entities in this place that like to mess with electronics. This has happened to me in Nepal, happened to me in Borobudur. There's the microphone will stop working, there'll be a glitch, the camera, I'll record something, I know I got it, and then I'll go back and look at the footage and it's just not there. Like, so this happens frequently. So it's a really challenging way to try to do storytelling. But I guess the style came from, I don't know, I think the artistic process at like its purest form is a sort of like, like a cousin to deity yoga. We gather the merit by practicing a craft, learning how to use the camera, playing an instrument, whatever your art is, and then you begin to kind of connect to that muse, right? And you start to develop a relationship, and you start to be able to kind of channel whatever the energy of that muse is into a physical creation. And someone that's really developed a relationship with the artistic muse can start to really dance that energy, and they can they can take on those attributes into themselves and really transform themselves. So I think that was always the real purpose of art. It was kind of lost in the last, half century or more, that its kind of heart has become fused with commercialism and fame and status and likes, and which is not to like demonize like modern technology or anything, because I use a lot of like AI tools and other things to kind of create the style, which was partly because I was threatened by that, because my job is like probably going to disappear in a couple of years because I make, most of my income through design and, stylistic things. So it was sort of a way of like, okay, I can work with it. I could be afraid of this thing, or I can work with it. I can try to alchemize it into something that's actually can bring the art back to what, it always was. And it can actually allow me to do things that I was never talented enough to do at the beginning. Or I've just been too lazy, so it makes it easier to create. So I think these tools are actually great for that if you use them, as long as like, what's at that center, what's the center? What are you using the tools for? What is the art for? And like how, I don't know, because the style, like, I don't know, maybe that's just my own style, what you're responding to. But for me, the style comes from the muse. It comes from getting myself out of the way and just flowing with it, like music. So I don't really know how to like describe how I thought about the style or any of that. It was more of just opening myself up to those energies and allowing it to try to, get past me and just be a clear window for that stuff to come through, which I think is, again, the whole purpose of art. It was always that. It was always to be used as a vehicle to kind of awaken to what your true nature always was, which was the muse.
I just have to add, because I was a fly on the wall for a lot of this for Matthew, that he went on a hero's journey with his own production and his own creativity. I think he took a lot of risks, and to be honest, it wasn't all that pleasant, right, Matthew? I mean, you had moments of despair around it and overwhelm, and if you go on a pilgrimage and you go on the heroic journey and you try to offer something to the world, you can't help but have a dark night of the soul moment, a confrontation. I mean, one of the things I said at the outset of this conversation was how much I respect Matthew's, like, he put it all on the line. And honestly, like, I'm not just trying to pump you up, Matthew. Like, I think it's one of the biggest teachings that I had out of this whole process was, financially, you were in a situation where you had to delay gratification, put on pause, or at least jeopardize how you would make an income to support your family, to pursue some deeper calling inside of you that had no intrinsic, had no extrinsic reward contingency. It wasn't like you were going to make fame, fortune, money, opportunity out of it. It was like, I mean, I find that just really relatable and really important in the story. Yes, your design is truly unique. It's impeccable and it's eye-catching, and it conveys the message so beautifully. But one of the real take-homes I want to reiterate here, watching you do it, is just, if you're going to produce something, you have to wager something, you have to risk something. And the way you describe the muse and the deity yoga, I think that's, yes, I see that. I can see that, and I really respect that. What you were driven by was devotion, curiosity, altruism. And I'm not just saying that with words. Like, I think this is one, I mean, most of the viewers for the Guru Viking podcast is going to relate to this idea that we start our spiritual practices with cultivating the right motivation and aspiration. But what we don't always talk about is that it's a rough fucking road sometimes. And you keep your North Star and it meanders through the labyrinth, and you hit your head a bunch of times, and probably in the darkness of your own, studio there, you hit moments where you were really alone with the content, not knowing, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, how are you going to splice together this thing? And yes, it's true, you relied on something that spoke through you. And that's what this gift is really about. But there's also the human side of it and the human sacrifice of it, which is like the toil that your spiritual practice takes, and that you persevere through that. I mean, that's a really remarkable part of it, and I think a really relatable part of it, the part that really inspired me. It's like, yes, the final product is amazing, and what goes into these final products that no one will ever know. I was there and I watched it, and I was inspired by it, because in a world like the one we're living in, it shows us how we're really going to get through. There is no clear pasture. There is no, still water to sail through. It's rough. And what gets you through the rough is your aspiration, a true aspiration of integrity. That's what will get us through. And so, yeah, I mean, if everything is a microcosm reflected in the macrocosm, the way that the movie came together, the constituent parts and players, they have their individual lives where they're reflecting the message of the overall movie at the same time. So I think I just needed to say that too about you, Matthew. Thank you.
That's very kind. I just want to say that I part of this journey was about being comfortable with it, interjecting my own story into it, because I think that was one of the things that always bothered me about documentary filmmaking, is that it pretends to be objective when every story we tell, and you actually go and, as I saw in this industry, it's subjective from the start, right? So you're always bringing, you can never tell the story. You can only tell your experience of the story. And I tried to do that the best I could, but it's really important to me to invite people who are watching it to be more than just a viewer. Because I think these types of spiritual technologies aren't bound by time or location in the ways that we rationally would think. So it's my hope that, like, someone watching, whenever they're watching, wherever they're watching, it's like, can they align their intentions with this symbol? And what is it bringing up in their own lives around what peace means to them, and how what they can visualize in that moment? Because at the end, you're brought into the ceremony with us, and you're invited to imagine what peace looks like. What does it feel like in your body? And you're in that moment, you're chaining yourself to that energy and to that archetype. And I don't think it's any different than if you were physically there with us. So I always wanted this to be a way of, like, inviting this in, because otherwise it sounds like, oh, these two guys are pretty lucky. They got to go hang out with these two masters and be at this top in this experience, and wow, how lucky. I don't think that I'm special in any way. That I believe the only reason I was able to be here was to be able to document that so other people can bring their intention to the symbol, and in doing so, it can spread. And that's why I didn't want to, like, try to make money from this or put it out on somewhere where you have to pay to see it. I just put it on YouTube because I want as many people as possible to just feel what that felt like. And that's my largest hope for this project, because I really feel that that's the most important thing we all can be doing, especially in these times, especially as we look ahead to what's going to happen over the next year or two, that we're all sort of feeling this energy coming. What can we do? We can imagine, what is peace? What's at that center of the mandala? Where is your heart at? And just settle there. So that's my hope for the project.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. The missing piece. Miles Neale and Matthew Freidell, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.